Today, we are going to be discussing Alexander the Great. Throughout our entire presentation, we're firstly going to be talking about the rise of Alexander the Great. Then we're going to move into the political and military influences of Alexander the Great. Thirdly, the expansion of Greek culture. And lastly, the decline of Alexander the Great and the aftermath. Now, the best place to start when talking about the rise of Alexander the Great is his childhood and growing up years. But before we get into that, let's discuss how Alexander actually got into power. Well, firstly, his father, Philip II of Macedon, was in the process of conquering foreign lands, so he was a royal by blood. But Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC, leading to Alexander inheriting the throne at the age of 20. Now, I want to stop really fast right here and just think. We are around the age that Alexander was whenever he inherited the throne of a vast nation that was going to grow so much more. And I just want you to think, what would you do in this scenario? I know I would be freaking out. But luckily, Alexander had a great upbringing to prepare him for this. So this is kind of what makes him so great from the start, is that he learned to read, write, play the lyre, and also was exposed to a lot of politics in his young years. Now, this learning didn't just stop, however, whenever he was like 12, 13. He instead kept learning. And he learned from one of the greatest visionaries of the time, Aristotle. Aristotle taught him science, medicine, and botany, which really just made him into the leader that he became. We can see later in his years, which you'll hear about eventually through the process of this presentation, that Alexander did bring scientists and botanists throughout him on his conquering missions. That way he could really get a good grasp of the world around him. Now, going back to that growing up in politics, Alexander grew up in war. While learning his sciences and histories, he was also gaining extensive knowledge on the battlefield. Prior to the gaining of the crown, Alexander was in military control around the year 340 BC, so about 4 years before he got into power officially. This allowed him to gain increasing amounts of experience as a wartime leader, which really allowed him to continue being such a great conqueror because he knew what he had to do on the battlefield. And this leads us into the political and military influences of Alexander the Great.
Hello, my name is Catherine Cushing, and I will be covering the political and military achievements and modern influences of Alexander the Great. First, we have his military advancements, of which he is most known for his tactics in battle, where he used the seasons and terrain to his advantage against his enemies, which was still somewhat revolutionary at the time. He also developed the idea of strike forces separate from the supply chain, who would separate soldiers from the main caravan with only days of rations and weaponry to be carried by the soldiers so they could quickly advance on enemy positions. In addition, he was also able to unify his diverse army by personally leading the battle from the front, which also helped him develop troop formations that allowed decimation of armies far larger than his. To make all of this work, he ensured a solid supply chain between captured cities and his bases, so that his soldiers were always well fed, and made sure to account for travel through deserts and mountains and when the growing seasons were, so his soldiers avoided starvation on their expeditions. How many of these tactics have you heard of before? Politically, he is perhaps most famous for his conquering of the Persian Empire, which he managed to keep somewhat stable after its official end. Additionally, he conquered through most of Asia Minor, Syria, and Babylonia, as well as ruling Egypt. This was a significant portion of the known world at the time under his command. He worked in these places with force, but also diplomacy, conquering, but not being unnecessarily cruel to the inhabitants, and even adopted some of their court customs while leaving behind some of his own, setting the stage for the Hellenistic period. Many of these tours resulted in the fulfilling of divine prophecies, such as solving the Gordian knot, prophecy to be done by the king of Asia, being regarded as the divine son of Amun in Egypt during his reign as pharaoh, and titled King of the World by the Babylonian astrologers during his invasion. Alexander's influence on the world is still visible today in many ways. Modern military schools and training still discuss his tactics on the field, as well as the effect he had on civilian populations as he worked to integrate Greek culture under his rule. His image has been continued to be disseminated in many great writings and cultural beliefs, such as the Bible and the Quran, as well as in modern Greek folklore among seamen. Additionally, many cultures adopted a version of the Alexander Romance, a description of the life of Alexander, and integrated him as a divine or prophetic figure in their cultures. In fact, a multitude of historical figures have compared themselves to Alexander, either as a figure they could imitate, such as Pompey and Aludin Kiliji, or Napoleon. He was known to be a hero to other major leaders, such as Mehmed II, Fidel Castro, and even Julius Caesar, who lamented that he could never be as great a leader as Alexander. His effect on the world has spread beyond his empire and continues to live through modern history.
Next, we will go into discussing the Greek culture, kickstarting Greek influence. Alexander the Great begins his mission of expanding Greek culture throughout his empire by creation of new cities. By creating new cities within his empire, opened the door to Greek influences within his reign, resulting in Greeks migrating their way to such cities. With numerous Greeks calling their new home within Alexander the Great's empire, followed their cultural touch within the empire, ranging from literature, arts, and etc. These are two examples of such cities. We have Alexandria in Bucephalus and Alexandria in the Caucasus. Now, asking the big question, how was the culture within Alexander the Great's empire? Alexander's goal was to collaborate a variety of cultures under one empire. Looking at religion specifically, as a result of Alexander the Great giving tribute to a variety of religions, most felt welcome under his rule, such as Egyptians and Persians, as Alexander respected their gods. Individuals felt so connected that a religion called the Serapis formed. The Serapis collaborated Egyptian gods also with Greek gods. Now jumping to the arts. During Alexander's ruling, there were major advancements within art. These advancements range from drawing, sculpting, revealing the reality of expressions and dimensions of the human body. One of the most famous sculptors at the time of Alexander was named Leochares. He was specifically chosen to create sculptures of the royal family. He developed famous sculptures ranging from Philip II, Alexander, Olympias, etc. More within the culture, we see architecture. Throughout each of Alexander's cities, the architecture embedded reveals the cultures during the time. Buildings, temples, and monuments surrounded towns. Some of the famous architecture symbols during the time were the Pharaoh's lighthouse and the Temple of Artemis, and much more. So, you may be wondering, how did the culture within Alexander's rule spread? And part of that is language. With the help of language, cultural influences spread across vast empires. Within Alexander the Great's empire, Greek language was very prominent, so much so that language was divided into classes. Your upper class, which included more of your rulers, was classical Greece. And you get into your lower class, that being the working within urban locations, you have your everyday Greek language, or more informal Greek. With the immense influence that Alexander the Great had on culture, inspired a period in time called the Hellenistic period. Before Alexander's death, an immense amount of cultural ideals and beliefs spread all across the empire. The culture that was most prominent of them all was the Greek culture. Alexander helped Greek culture exchange its ideas through vast regions like never before. So much so that soon after his death resulted in a new world of touching on ideas and mindsets of the Greek culture throughout different regions other than his own.
Hey everyone, so the decline of Alexander the Great starts with one thing, his death. On June 11th, 323 BCE in Babylon, at age 32, Alexander the Great dies. But the exact cause of his death is shrouded in mystery, with many assumptions being made by historians. What we do know is he suffered from symptoms of abdominal pain, delirium, and fever, resulting in an 11-day battle and his perishing. The possible causes of his demise have been grouped into categories including infectious disease, alcohol-induced, internal organ damage, poisoning, and other issues which we will look at briefly to discover more about how he may have died. Possible infectious diseases Alexander could have succumbed to include malaria, typhoid fever, and West Nile encephalitis. Typhoid fever could explain his abdominal pain, and without modern antibiotics and treatment methods, as we learned previously in this course, this is often fatal. However, the timing of his symptoms does not exactly line up with those of typhoid fever, impacting the validity of this theory. The alcohol-induced theory comes from information historians have on Alexander periodically consuming large quantities of wine. During his illness, he opted to drink wine to quench his thirst instead of water, so definitely an interesting choice. However, his fever cannot be explained by excessive alcohol, and he was not observed to be vomiting, which is a common symptom of alcohol intoxication. Organ damage could have been caused by ulcers or pneumonia, and some believe he was even poisoned, with many different poisons like arsenic and belladonna postulated as reasons. His poisoners could have been anyone from his jealous wife, Roxanne, to unsatisfied lieutenants. And other complications include various theories concerning previous injuries that he may have sustained in battle. Overall, we may never reach absolute certainty over the cause of Alexander the Great's death unless his remains were to be recovered. Still, there's a lot of supporting evidence for certain beliefs, and hopefully you've come to your own ideas about his passing. So next, we'll look at the outcomes of his death. Now, the aftermath of Alexander the Great is one of chaos and confusion. Without Alexander, there was no government and no authority. There were two likely candidates that could be considered as a possible successor. First, Alexander's half-brother, Arrhenius, who was already in Babylon, but considered mentally handicapped. And second, Alexander's patrician wife, Roxanne's child. But this future Alexander IV was not born yet. Neither of these suggested successors ended up working out, and Alexander's failure to name an heir or successor had left his commanders to attempt to divide the empire amongst themselves, resulting in the Successor Wars, or the Wars of the Diadochi. For 3 decades, alliances were made and broken over the 4 wars of the Diadochi, centered around 3 individuals and their descendants: Antigonus Monophtolemos, Seleucus Nicator, and Ptolemy Soter. These are who would usher in the Hellenistic period and bringing to existence 3 dynasties that would exist for 2 more centuries. So here are all of our works cited, and thank you for watching our video. We hope you learned a little more about Alexander the Great and the years he was alive. Next, we have a QR code you can scan with your phone that brings you to a Google form with some quick questions to test your knowledge on the material we covered.